Do you find yourself constantly getting tossed around by Apollo, or maybe even slammed into the wall against a Venator with his melee build? Well, luckily enough, I got you covered. Whether it's a specific item type or just general strategy, today I'm teaching you how to counter every single hero in Deadlock. And if you find it helpful in any way, shape, or form, make sure to hit that like button. Of course, subscribe to the channel if you want to see more of this content, and share it to the friends so they can stop feeding in your next Deadlock match. And without further ado, let's dive straight in. Now, we begin with Abrams. The first thing you need to keep in mind is that you have to have your parry button bound and understood. Abrams likes to melee, especially after using his shoulder charge, so understanding how the melee and parry interaction works is a key strategy at countering this character. Your biggest counter items in this game are going to be toxic bullets because they build up bleed on enemies, especially because he has that passive healing or that healing that he gathers from his drain. Healbane is also a great item because your spirit damage applies a healing reducer debuff. Following that, you also have the K, which inflicts damage over time to a target, Siphon Bullets, and of course Unstoppable when he goes to use his ultimate or his shoulder charge ability. All are great items to buy, doesn't really matter the order. Now, you can actually counter some of his specific abilities. Take, for example, his charge. If you parry immediately, if you suspect a follow-up melee or use mobility to dash away. If you parry just before he gets the shoulder charge off, sometimes it'll carry that parry over. Now, if you find yourself in the early game and you're struggling to survive against him, you can think about building early armor or stamina to increase your HP and dodge capability. This is definitely more recommended until you can build stronger damage items in the later game. The one key issue in the laning phase with Abrams is that if in lane, you want to farm safely near your Guardian and avoid engaging in close quarters until you have enough damage items to outburst his healing capabilities. Because with his healing ability, a lot of the trades are never going to be in your own benefit. So these are all things to keep in mind. Now, moving on to Apollo. Countering Apollo requires a mix of kiting, abating his offensive cooldowns, and specific itemization to neutralize his ability and mobility. The big thing is to bait the riposte. Never open with your most powerful ability because Apollo players often look to riposte heavy telegraphed attacks. Instead, you want to bait it out with a light melee or basic gunfire once the riposte is on a lengthy 22-second cooldown. He is much more vulnerable. Now, moving on to the items, Slowing Hex is probably the best hard counter, and for rightfully so. Now, Slowing Hex disables the ability to recast Flawless Advance, effectively ending his mobility and damage combo instantly. Then, of course, you want to be looking at Spirit Resistance and Spellbreaker because almost all of Apollo's burst damage is spirit-based. Items like Spellbreaker or General Spirit Armor are vital. Now, Spellbreaker is particularly effective because it can negate a massive chunk of his lunge or ultimate damage. Following that counterspell, his ultimate is telegraphed and can be delayed, but you can use counterspell to negate the damage even after the slow motion effect has landed on you. Then, of course, you have your other pretty standard silencing items in quotations. You have Knockdown and Silence Wave, which just really make Apollo players really annoyed. That's pretty much it. Moving on, we come to Bebop, and this requires prioritizing items that cleanse or reduce his bomb or hook combo damage, specifically debuff remover, skin, bolt armor, and of course knockdown. Now, during laning, he's always going to be looking to try to place a bomb on you so you can start farming those stacks. So you want to avoid standing near ledges, you want to use minions as shields to block hooks, and play behind walls to minimize visibility. You want to do your best to try to keep stamina in laning phase so that you can dodge his hooks when need be. And of course, you want to respect his range. You want to avoid standing close to him. His hook is easiest to land in close range. Then again, just to re-emphasize, your essential items are Debuff Remover, the best item to remove his sticky bomb immediately, Counterspell or Veilwalker, used to avoid getting hooked in the first place, Healbane, Toxic Bullets, crucial to stop his lifesteal, especially if he builds for gun damage or he's building for his uppercut. Then you want to think about E-Shift, use this to become invulnerable when the bomb is about to detonate. And you can also do Metal Skin if you, for whatever reason, is building gun B-Bump, although currently not necessarily the best. Then you have your mid or late game. You want to use silences or interruptions to use items like Curse to stop him from using his ultimate or even to hook him more. And of course, map awareness is going to be your biggest and best friend, as if he is missing from the map, assume he's setting up a hook, trap, whatever the case may be, as he is quite mobile, especially if it has Veilwalker, so these are all great things to keep in mind. Now, moving on, we come to Calico. Now, countering Calico in Deadlock relies on anti-mobility and anti-heal items to shut her high speed and diving playstyle down. Your essential items should include Slowing Hex, as it's the premier counter, preventing her from using her dash, heal, or ultimate abilities. Not necessarily preventing her from using, but just slowing her down. Healbane or Toxic Bullets are necessary to negate her sustain, and Knockdown and Silencing Wave can stop her combos. Now, following that, some movement mitigation, Ethereal Shift can be used to dodge your ultimate's final damage. Now, in terms of combo tactics, you want to think about parrying. Calico relies on her Leaping Slash and Light Melee, making her vulnerable to parrying. You just have to understand the timing. Then you have distance in positioning. You want to avoid mid-range fighting, where her cluster bombs are strongest, and you want to keep the distance or fight in a very close range. The character heavily relies on cooldown tracking, so you want to force her to waste her abilities, especially her ultimate, then collapse on her when she is vulnerable. Another big thing is targeting. Calico is rather squishy, so team coordination, sticking together, prevents her from isolating and deleting players. You can also think about using Restorative Locket a lot earlier in laning phase if you make it that far, but those are some key things to keep in mind.
Now, countering Celeste in Deadlock requires high burst damage to kill her quickly, spirit damage reduction, and anti-heal items. Now, in terms of items, you want to think about items like Counterspell, Spellbreaker, highly effective to mitigate her burst damage and sustain. Anti-heal items such as Decay, Healbane, Toxic Bullets, it's crucial to counteract her self-healing. You can also think about Knockdown or Slowing Hex, items like that, and even Silence to prevent her from using her abilities or escaping. Reactive Barrier is an honorable mention as it's good for survivability against her crowd control abilities. Now, in terms of your gameplay tactics, you want to isolate yourself. If you're targeted by her ultimate, you want to move away from the pack. Lane creeps and jungle creeps to prevent the damage from continuously chaining together. And again, you want to think about high burst damage heroes. Think about Mina, Pocket, Lash, the whole works to try to get rid of her quickly. Now, moving on to Doorman, probably one of the more annoying characters in the entire game in my personal opinion. It requires using Counterspell to negate his ultimate and damage abilities, along with Slowing Hex to prevent his portal usage. So again, your essential items are Counterspell. You use it to negate his ultimate, his call-bell, and luggage cart. And you can specifically, when timed right, at the end of his ultimate, so you negate the damage output. Kind of like using a repulse on Apollo when he's at the very end of Doorman's ult. Then you can also think about using items like Slowing Hex, Debuff Remover to reduce the duration of his stuns and debuffs, Warpstone, Superior Stamina used to escape his cart as it requires him to be on the ground. And you can also think about knockdowns used to disrupt his initiations or anything of that sort. Then you can think about using silences or interrupts to silence the doorman before he engages to prevent him from using his doorway or even luggage cart, so that if he's trying to escape, you silence him, he no longer has the ability to use his doorway, so pretty useful in that aspect. Now, for ability mitigation, for his callbell, you want to purchase extra health or spirit shielding early to mitigate his high burst damage in the early stages. Then his luggage cart, you could use Reactive Barrier to absorb damage as it activates when he uses his cart. And that's essentially how you counter Doorman at the bare bones. Now, moving on to our Vampire Drifter. Now, in Deadlock, Drifter gains stacks by doing assists or getting final eliminations. So avoiding 1v1 engagements are extremely encouraged, as his Bloodline passive grants bonus damage against isolated targets. So you want to travel sometimes as a duel to kind of disable this passive. You want to think about using items like Metal Skin, Disarming Hex, Rusted Barrel, and Suppressor to mitigate his gun-reliant damage, and use Dispel Magic to remove his damage over time effects. So again, just a quick summary, your key strategies to counter Drifter are to stick together, counter items such as Disarming Hex, weapon items, so you want to use Disarming Hex to prevent him from attacking in teamfights, defensive items such as Metal Skin makes you immune to his gun damage, while Plated Armor and Bullet/Spirit Resistance mitigate his overall damage. Then you have Dispel or Disport. Dispel Magic negates his Stalker Marks, his damage over time, and Teleport ability. All are great recommendations. Now, sometimes if the Drifter isn't that smart of a player, if you get marked by him, you can just go to your tower, or you can try to go to your teammate to try to bait him in. Then you can also think about parrying. Usually, you can predict his teleport melee combo. Usually, he goes in teleports and procs a heavy melee or using his one ability in some sort of variation or combo. So being able to parry on time is pretty crucial. Then focus fire, you want to group up to make him ineffective in team fights, focus firing him down, as typically drifters can rack up a ton of damage if left unchecked. So Dynamo, you want to prioritize spreading out to avoid his team-wide ultimates. You want to use items like Knockdown or Curse to interrupt his Singularity, and buy Unstoppable or Ethereal Shift to survive it. So you want to keep distance, as his abilities are sometimes short range but do prioritize a lot of damage. Depending on his build, his knockup goes a rather large distance. So again, you want to interrupts, Knockdown, Curse, all great ideas. Survival items could be Unstoppable, Ethereal Shift, and Reactive Barrier are super crucial. Then positioning, you don't necessarily want to group up against a Dynamo. Depending on their team composition, if it's just a Dynamo you have to worry about, then you're free to play a little bit more loose. But if you're running into a Lash Dynamo combo, it can be rather difficult and unavoidable at some points. That's why items such as Unstoppable or Ethereal Shift are probably high priorities. Then you want to think about disruption. Using Warpstone or Bebop's hooks can mess up his positioning. Counters, silences shut down his ability to cast, and slowing Hex prevent him from being able to close the distance quite quickly. For the most part, Dynamo is a character all about utility, not necessarily about weapon damage. So just understanding that his utility is his biggest win conditions are the best way to shut him down. So being able to use items to counteract his abilities is always a must. Moving on to Graves, the split push god. So you want to focus on high burst damage, range advantages, and consistent anti-heal to negate her sustain. Your big strategies include trying to find her tombstone, getting rid of it as quickly as possible, as that's one of the ways she can pressure your team around the map. So the big thing is that you want to keep distance, especially in the laning phase, as she is short range character. However, she can rack up a ton of damage on you because she has her auto aim gun and her pickles, what I like to call, or her soul jar or her skull jar. So your best counter items are things like disarming hex, silence wave, rusted barrel if you want to, spirit shielding, weapon shielding, it mitigates her burst damage. Anti-heal are essential for reducing her overall sustain, so think about heal bane, toxic bullets, etc. Then lane management. Do not let her minions kill your own. You want to prioritize denying her wave as quickly as possible. The big thing about Graves is she likes to split push. No matter where on the map, she will try to do her best to get that walker. Now, the thing is, when you have such a split push heavy character, you have to divert resources to said walker or to wherever she's putting those resources. So you can think of it one of two ways. If you're taking a team fight, the team fight is always going to be in your favor because you are in a 6v5. The big thing, however, though, is if you're going for that team fight, she could be getting your walker. So it's a risk-reward scenario. You can try to go for the 6v5 wipe to wipe the enemy team, but you lose the walker. It's always a gamble of whether it's a good idea or a bad idea. It honestly just depends at the state of the match and the state of the game you're currently in, whether or not it's worth taking that team fight, risking it for that said walker. Now, honestly, the big thing for early lane is to buy extra regeneration to handle her consistent but low damage pokes, and then countering her ultimate. If she ults, you can heavily melee her tombstone, but you just have to figure out where it is. Usually, they put them on the ground, but in the higher elos or wars, I guess smarter players will put them higher up in places it might be rather difficult to destroy. So these are all things you have to keep in mind. Now, moving on to Great Talon. Now, Great Talon and Deadlock heavily prioritize spirit armor to negate his damage. You want to use knockdowns or silencing glyphs to interrupt his flight, and constantly use vertical covers or buildings to avoid his ultimate. You can also use debuff remover and reducer to escape his traps. Now, Great Talon currently doesn't really build into weapon damage that much. He rather prioritizes spirit. So your defenses are going to be spirit armor, so essential for high spirit damage. And you can also think about like Veil Walker to try to go through the veil to avoid him and his owl. Also think about items like a Spellbreaker. These are all great examples. Then for more items, you want to think about crowd control or anti-air. So knockdown, silencing glyph, silencer, all of these are great items as it stops utility and forces him down and away from the fight. Basically, the longer or more uptime the character has, the more damage he's going to be outputting, especially with his charged shot. So these are great things to keep in mind. In terms of gameplay, you want to hide from his L, so you want to use buildings, corners, and vertical structures when you hear his ultimate, and just calling it out, letting your teammate know that he's looking for ult are all great ideas. Then you want to punish him in his flight. When he's up in the air, he doesn't have the best horizontal escape. He can use his dashes, but he doesn't travel as fast as he once did. So try to shoot at him while he's in the air is probably one of your better options, even though he is a little bit more scary as he is in that heightened advantage. Then trap awareness, you want to look for his traps so that you don't get hit by them. It can be a pretty detriment to yourself if you get hit by that, especially later on in the matches when it actually affects you like a curse. Now, some personal hero recommendations are characters like McGinnis because it can wall off the owl. Sev and Warden are good at punishing him with range or crowd control effects. And then Lash, of course, is a well-rounded character that can quickly close the gap to engage on him and just move him around, knock him around to try to get rid of him as quickly as possible. Now, moving on to Haze. Now, Haze is a rather interesting character in shutting down, in my personal opinion, because she's less about, understanding how she works and more about just prioritizing certain items. You want to build items like Metal Skin, Return Fire, Knockdown, Silencing Wave, all the works to try to stop her. She relies heavily on invisibility and high damage bullet lifesteal, so using crowd control or breaking line of sight and forcing her early fights is key to reducing her impact. Now, two of my biggest tips is combat tips is you don't necessarily want to engage in prolonged fights because she is building up her passive, so you want to avoid her damage scaling by breaking line of sight to reset her stacks. Then map control. Actively hunt her down to prevent her from getting farmed, as Fed Haze is rather difficult to stop. Most of the time, if the Haze loses in lane, they just AFK farm, so if you can just try to do anything to slow down her impact or slow down her farming speed, are probably going to be some of the best ideas. Now, moving on to Holiday. So, mobility and survival are key. So, Ethereal Shift blocks damage, Warpstone equals repositioning, and Unstoppable removes the stun or lasso are critical for surviving her combos. Then for damage mitigation, Spirit Armor and Reactive Barrier help mitigate her high burst, as she often relies on spirit damage. Crowd control, so knockdowns, forces her to the ground. Slowing Hex reduces her mobility, preventing her from using her jump pads. Now, in terms of positioning, it's really hard to position against a character that is literally flying through the air after a bounce pad looking to lasso you. But you can keep your distance and avoid playing in tight spaces where her barrel explosion area is her hardest to dodge. Now, one big thing is if you're playing some sort of util or supportive character and you're using Rescue Beam, you can use Rescue Beam to save said person from the lasso, which is a big win and something you should definitely think about if you're playing characters that utilize that item, whether it's a Paige, Rem, Viscous, or any other supportive character. So moving on to Infernus. So Infernus and Deadlock, you want to prioritize anti-heal items such as Heal Bane, Toxic Bullets, and Decay to negate his lifesteal. And you want to think about Debuff Reducer to mitigate his afterburn damage. Both some sort of spirit resilience and bullet resistance are all pretty good. Slowing Hex prevents him from using his flame dash too much to escape or reposition. And then for laning and gameplay, you want to avoid long trades. You don't want to engage in prolonged face-to-face fights early on, as his damage over time will win. You want to manage his burn stack. So understand that the burn only triggers after a certain number of hits, and if you're burned, you want to wait for it to fall off rather than immediately fighting back. So because of that, you want to burst him down. He is, rather squishy in the early stages. A little bit later on, he's a little bit more tanky. So you want to use high burst damage heroes to eliminate him before he can heal. Then, of course, control or silence, you want to use crowd control to stop him from escaping with his flame dash and try to avoid his ultimate as best as possible. Now, moving on to Ivy. Now, dealing with Ivy requires building anti-heal items like toxic bullets, heal bane, or decay to negate her sustain. These are all big and true. Then you want to think about silence or control items such as silence glyph, curse, knockdown, etc. Now mobility and extra stamina, warpstone are all great when she goes into stone form trying to smash you and stun you. Now the biggest thing, especially in the laning phase, is to punish her early. Ivy is rather weak in the early stages of the game, so you want to capitalize on this to gain a lane advantage. The faster you can take control of that lane and just basically make her impact not existent, the better off your team is going to be, because eventually, depending on what she builds, she, ramps up just the amount of damage, the amount of support, and everything else associated with the character in general. Now, moving on to Kelvin. So, countering Kelvin and Deadlock, prioritizing anti-heal items such as Healbane, Toxic Bullets Decay is pretty much the go-to standard for a lot of the characters in the game to negate his self-healing in Frozen Shelter Ultimate. So, you want to use mobility items like extra stamina, fleet foot to dodge his Arctic Beam and leverage his high damage close range weapons as his early damage is rather low. So for itemizations, anti-heal, essential for countering his one Frost Grenade and his ultimate ability, Frozen Shelter. Second, mobility or some tool for escaping, extra stamina, fleet foot, unstoppable to escape his slow inducing beam. Then you want to think about lockdown or crowd control abilities, knockdown, silencing gift, silencing wave to interrupt his movement and casting. For your defensives, you need spirit armor or shield to mitigate his beam damage. You don't really need any gun resilience because he's no longer a gun Kelvin character. Then in terms of gameplay tactics, you want to focus on denying souls and you want to dodge his grenade. As he is a projectile based character, it's easier to deny him from getting souls. In terms of combat, you don't necessarily want to overextend because he can slow you if you're overextended, which can be disastrous for you and the rest of your team. And that's really about it. He is a tankier character and a supportive character, so you have to understand in these circumstances that when a support is up for a long time, they're going to be pumping healing and resources. The faster you can get rid of said supports, the easier it is to roll over the team. But again, never want to overextend because you might get caught out. So moving on to Lady Geist. For your key strategies in counterplay, itemization, you want to build Healbane, Toxic Bullets, or Decay early to reduce her massive self-healing. Spirit Shield helps against her burst damage as well. Now in her lane phase, you want to do your best to dodge her Essence Bomb to prevent high damage and a ton of harassment because her skills cost health, so pressuring her when she uses abilities forces her to retreat. Then for life drain, you want to break line of sight immediately when she links you, and you want to use dashes to quickly get behind cover. Then for her ultimate, her counter has a relatively short range, her ultimate, her swap, so you want to use silence glyph, curse, knockdown to stop her from using it. Your hero matchups, heroes like Abrams, Vicktor are pretty much effective against her. But again, a lot of the items you're thinking about are silencing or knockdowns, anti-heal, and survivability are all really good. If she's building more of the gun route, guys, then you can think about like metal skin, or not necessarily metal skin, but some type of anti-bullet resist. Those are all good ideas to keep in mind. Now, moving on to Lash. Countering Lash in Deadlock requires negating his high mobility, ability-based burst damage with items like Silence Wave, Knockdown, Ethereal Shift, and during laning, you want to dodge his ground sound by rolling toward him and prioritizing building Spirit Armor. Use items like Unstoppable to negate his ultimate, and anti-heal items to reduce his self-sustain. So again, your key items: Knockdown, Ethereal Shift, Unstoppable, Slowing Hex, Spell Breaker, and Spirit Resistance. Reduce the damage from his high burst spirit abilities. Then for gameplay and laning tactics, you want to dodge the ground stem. Instead of rolling backwards, you actually want to roll forwards towards Lash when he initiates his ground smash. He cannot easily turn, making this a reliable dodge. And you can also use cover like Brain Lines of Sight to prevent him from locking onto you with his ultimate. You can also use the parry when he tries to melee, which is common during his combos. Now, lane management. If you cannot win the lane, you want to roam early or try to swap lanes.
Then of course, watch for the high ground. Be aware of his positioning, he thrives when attacking from above. So these are all great things you might want to consider when playing the game. Now moving on to McGinnis, the biggest things are itemizations. You want to purchase monster rounds for her turrets, you want to use anti-heal abilities, toxic bullets, heal bane, decay, and so on to counter her healing. You want to use Warp Zone, Ethereal Shift to survive her wall. And for laning and tactics, you don't necessarily want to 1v1 her in her turretness. You want to focus on high ground positioning and utilizing some cover so that the turrets don't take you for extra damage. In terms of movement, you could utilize her lack of mobility by picking fast, aggressive heroes. And in terms of ganking, you want to coordinate with your teammates to gank her as she is vulnerable when overextended. So, just to reiterate, your key items to counter McGinnis: toxic bullets, healbane, decay. Monster rounds for her turrets, warp stone, ethereal shift for escaping her walls, silence and curse to prevent her from using her abilities, and metal skin to mitigate her high damage with her main gun. Now, when it comes to countering Mina and Deadlock, you want to exploit her extremely low health pool with burst damage, and you want to use crowd controlled items like slowing hex, curse, silencer to stop her retreat escape. So again, your items should include purchasing slowing hex to shut down her ability. You want to use curse or silencer to prevent her from using abilities. Spirit armor or spirit resilience is effective against her damage, and on gameplay you want to focus on burst damage to eliminate her quickly due to her low health pool again. So again, utilize cover to break line of sight during her ultimate, and in laning phase you really want to pressure her early, as she is the strongest in the early game for sure, especially with her love bites. If playing against her, you want to focus on survival and farming rather than engaging in direct combat or one-on-ones. Now moving on to Mirage, one of the probably strongest late game carries there is in the game, because you really want to think about building reactive barrier early or metal skin to negate his tornado combo, and you want to utilize debuff remover or debuff reducer to cleanse his marks and scarabs, and buy toxic bullets or healbanes to reduce his sustain. And you want to avoid long range duels and capitalize on his cooldown, specifically after he uses his tornado. Understanding the cooldown timer for the tornado is a big factor. Debuff reducer is probably going to be one of your better options, especially because just how he stacks the game. And like I said, in laning, you'd really need to respect the stacks. When facing Mirage, you want to back off if you have 2+ stacks of his passive to avoid taking massive damage from a follow-up. Now, if Mirage is using his ultimate, to teleport, you can use silence, stuns, or high damage to cancel or eliminate him upon arrival or when he's in the process of TPing. Now, moving on to Mo and Krill. You want to prioritize anti-heal items, pretty straightforward. Toxic bullets, decay to negate their sustain, using high damage outputs to outpoke them, and purchasing unstoppable or debuff reducer, anything like that. By using items such as silencing wave or anything like that is also extremely beneficial. Use metal skin also to negate his gun damage when he try to pump his ult on you. And you capitalize on his weaknesses. They have 2 heads, making them easy to headshot, and their ultimate combo can be interrupted, so whenever you can, try your best to interrupt them whenever possible. Now moving on to Paige. So countering Paige in Deadlock requires exploiting her low health pool and long cooldowns and reliance on positioning. So focus fire her immediately in teamfights, and you want to use mobility to dodge her rooting abilities and utilize anti-heal or debuff items to negate her barriers and ultimate, as she is rather squishy. So a big thing is targeting and positioning. Because Paige is frail, made of a wet tissue paper, you want to focus fire her first in teamfights, especially if she overextends. Then you want to dodge the root, dodge the third ability, the AoE root, to avoid being immobilized. Then you want to punish her cooldowns. Engage her immediately after she uses her barrier or root ability, as she has few escaped options. You can think about counter-barrieing her, so damaging her barrier, specifically the white core, breaks it faster. Then at laning, you want to utilize strong early game heroes to pressure her, as she has a slow projectile weapon and relies on her barrier to honestly trade. You would think of items like debuff remover or / immunity, crucial for escaping her roots, anti-heal, necessary to counter her ultimate, healing horses, and secondary ability barrier. Then silencing wave stops her from casting her ultimate or escaping, and curse is excellent for disabling her before she can use her abilities. I mean, I guess spirit resist can help you survive through some of the damage it's going to be dealing. Of course, all you have to do is pay attention to when and where she uses her abilities, and that's pretty much how you get rid of Paige in short. Now moving straight down the list, we come to Paradox. Now countering Paradox in Deadlock requires breaking line of sight to avoid her kinetic carbine stun, utilizing cover to negate her Paradox Soul Swap ultimate, and by items like Ethereal Shift, Unstoppable, or Reactive Barrier to survive combos. Early game, you want to exploit her relatively long cooldowns, and during laning, you want to focus on pushing waves and staying behind minions to avoid a lot of her abilities. Now the big thing is ability management. You want to listen for the kinetic carbine revving sound to hide behind cover or to dodge, and if hit by the stun, use defensive items pretty quickly to avoid the follow-up damage. Now, positioning and movement. You want to constantly move behind cover to bait out shots. If she overextends, you can capitalize with your own stun or crowd control abilities. The biggest things to keep in mind for your defenses are things like Ethereal Shift, Unstoppable, and Reactive Barrier. In terms of utility, you can use a Silencing Wave or any silencing item to prevent her from using her abilities. And honestly, in the laning phase, you want to pressure her by focusing on clearing creeps and maintaining distance. Don't necessarily want to stand in the open, as she relies on pushing poor positioning. Now moving on to Pocket. Now countering Pocket requires high mobility, silences, and spirit resistance to survive his burst damage and ultimate affliction. So your key items include Silencer, Curse, Knockdown to stop the movement and abilities, and a big one is Debuff Reducer. Another big one is Slowing Heads, very good for, excellent for stopping them from escaping or repositioning. But the big thing is to avoid tight spots, do not stand behind cover if the Mirage is up as they use it to poke. Exploit his cooldowns when Pocket uses their cape or escape. Offensively, you want to capitalize on their lack of ability to engage, as the cooldown is long at 30 seconds at level 1. Now, the big thing is to respect the affliction. It's a massive AoE damage over time, and you want to use items to cleanse it or simply run away, as it's a long-lasting effect that could be reduced by Debuff Reducer / Remover. Of course, it's changed since then. But then a big thing is to manage the range. Because Pocket is squishy early, try to outrange him to burst him down before they can set up his combo. Now moving on to Rem. Now Rem in Deadlock requires high burst damage, anti-heal items, and preventing his escape by keeping him in combat. So you want to target him immediately after his tag along invulnerability ends, and you want to use silences or stuns to, destroy his low uppers, or use monster rounds to push lanes. The big thing is anti-heal. Rem relies heavily on healing through tag-along and little humpers. You want to use items like Healbane, Toxic Bullets, Decay, or Spirit Burn to negate this. And then you want to prevent escape. Rem cannot use Vents, Fast Travel, for 4 seconds if you do damage to him, so you want to keep him in combat to stop his repositioning. Then you want to think about targeting little helpers. His helpers can farm and heal creeps, so you can kill them or use monster rounds to keep lanes pressured high. If you're laning against a Rem, it's probably in your best interest to run monster rounds. Now, countering tag-along. When a Rem attaches to an ally, he becomes invulnerable, and you wait for this effect to end, then burst him down. You want to use Silencer or Debuff Remover to stop his combo. And then map awareness is pretty secure. Again, map awareness is important because you want to secure your center camps, as Rem often tries to steal them with his little helpers, so keeping those in mind is a big thing. Now moving on to 7. Now 7 is rather weak early game, so you want to shut him down early by denying farm. During his ultimate, you want to break line of sight immediately or sit behind cover and build spirit armor or heal reduction to reduce his lifesteal and damage. So the big thing is to interrupt his ultimate when he's using it. The big thing is going to be knockdown into curse or silence wave to stop the damage. Then positioning cover when 7 ults, run behind a wall or high ground to break line of sight. All of these are great examples, and if you don't have knockdown or he's running unstoppable, this is probably your best course of action. Another big thing is spirit armor, heal reduction to stop his healing inside of his ultimate, which is a great thing. And again, early game pressure, 7 has a low base health regen, and you want to exploit this in the laning phase by trading damage and preventing him from securing a ton of souls. Now moving on to Shiv, which is honestly probably the hardest character to counter because he is pretty unstoppable if he gets ahead, but your big thing should be prioritizing healing reduction items, Healbane, Toxic Bullets, Decay, Spirit Burn to negate his high sustain, and use Debuff Remover to cleanse his bleeds or Debuff Reducer. And you want to engage him with team focus, and you want to utilize constant poke damage to break his armor and use or parry his dashes in close combat. The big things are crowd control and just making sure he's locked down in place. For the most part, he does a ton of damage, but those are some big ideas. So counterplay tips is if he's using bloodletting to defer damage, you want to continue applying constant pressure rather than one big burst, which allows you to bypass this damage mitigation. And if you're drafting, if you know you're playing against a Shiv player, for example, you can use heroes with heavy poke or dot like Infernus or pocket to perform well against them. Of course, you never know for sure if you're playing against one, but sometimes it's a good idea to think about who to pick if you're playing, in that general elo or they're playing at the same time. This is just all hypothetical if you find yourself in that situation. Now, moving on to silver. A big thing is, yes, using anti-heal items because these characters are so strong with their healing effects. Now, whenever she transforms or trying to transform, disarming Hex to negate her weapon-dependent wolf form are incredibly useful and powerful. Also, slowing Hex, a great idea as well. Curse, also a great idea. You can think about Metal Skin as well if you want to. For mobility, you could think about Warp Zone to escape her leap and stun, and use a vertical to avoid her short-range swipes. Then, of course, Silence Wave or stun items to stop her from transforming or attacking are all great ideas. For the most part, the character is pretty reliant on the wolf form. You can get away with dealing her when she's in her human form, but if she goes all in on you in the wolf form, just spam all of your cooldowns on top of her. Now, I'm moving on to Sinclair. The biggest things are mobility and dodging. You want to use sprint boots or stamina items to move unpredictably because his gun has slow bullet velocity, but fast movements makes it difficult for him to land shots. Then close range aggression. Sinclair is strongest at mid-range, so you want to pressure him in close range quarters as his bolts deal less damage up close, forcing him to react, especially if you can get behind him. Then for defensive items, purchase Spirit Armor to mitigate damage from his Spectral Assistant. Reactive Barrier is effective against his transformation abilities, while slowing Hex prevents him from switching to his Assistant. Then you want to avoid staying in the same corner or predictable spots. You want to utilize the verticality of the map to break his line of sight. Then exploit his early game. Sinclair is generally weak early on, so you want to focus on pushing lanes hard to prevent him from getting out of any sort of advantage. Now I'm moving on to Vindict. So you want to exploit his relatively low mobility and reliance on close range and high damage combos, so you use mobility items to keep the distance and purchase armor to mitigate his weapon damage. Metal Skin, bullet resistant armor, debuff, reducer, disarming Hex, Majestic Leap, Rusted Barrel, Warp Zone, whatever the case may be, are all great ideas. Honestly, in the beginning phases of lane, Rusted Barrel, pretty good option. You also want to avoid close quarters because he thrives on getting those shotguns, knocks, or stuns against the wall. And you can also destroy his traps. Make sure you destroy his traps and punish the laning phase. Poke him early. He struggles to retaliate effectively outside of the gut shot ability. And then you want to interrupt and disengage. Use crowd control to disrupt his combo flow, and that's pretty much the character wrapped up pretty easily. Now, moving on to Vicktor. Vicktor is rather an annoying character if he gets strong in his farms, so anti-heal are essentials. Vicktor relies on healing from his Pain Battery and innate sustain, so you want to buy Healbane early or mid-game and transition to Spirit Burn, Toxic Bullets, or Inhibitor, whatever character you're running, to ruin his survivability. Now, control and silence are big ideas. Silence items like Silencer, Silence Wave prevent him from using his aura. And then distance and kiting are major. Vicktor has limited range, so you want to use high mobility heroes or items to stay out of his immediate proximity. Utilizations, you can think about debuff reducer, essentially to counter his slows. You want to use slowing Hex or knockdowns / disarms to keep away. Damage / resistances are like focus lens for damage or spirit / bullet resist items. For your gameplay tactics is you want to bully him early. He is weak in the early laning phase and you want to keep him low on HP and focus others. Sometimes ignoring him in teamfights to kill his damage dealing allies is more effective. But that being said, you definitely need to shut down and lock down this character whenever you can if he is running at your team. So these are all great ideas to keep in mind. But anyways, moving on to Vindict, probably one of the longest standing characters in the game, and Deadlock requires aggressive close quarters combat and utilizing knockdown to ground her flight and breaking line of sight to avoid her sniper. So you want to use dive characters to ambush her and purchase items like Slowing Hex, Silencer, or Silencing Wave, Curse to shut her down with her abilities. Knockdown is a pretty much essential item. Disarming Hex, really good idea. And for positioning and map awareness, you want to break her line of sight by hiding behind structures, bridges or inside buildings to avoid her shots. And you want to keep track of her positioning on the map to avoid being picked off while low on health. Typically, once a Vindicta gets her ultimate in lane, she'll be paying attention to the other lane so she can quickly roam and try to get a quick pick. So these are all ideas you have to keep in mind so you don't just get absolutely destroyed by Vindicta. Now, moving on ahead to Viscous, you want to think about Silence. It's highly effective as it prevents him from using the cube or goo ball. Mobility Warp Zone helps dodge Puddle Punch. Make sure you're also parrying the Puddle Punch. It avoids you from taking damage. Some other big things is crowd control. Knockdown interrupts their momentum during goo ball. Resistance can either be a bullet or spirit. Help survive their damage output. So in terms of the management, avoid being baited by the ball and focus on other targets if necessary. You want to utilize distance and verticality to avoid being hit. Then of course you have characters with high crowd control effects. Heroes that can lock down Viscous or silence them are extremely strong. Also characters that have super high mobility also excel in this category. Now I'm moving on to Viper. Countering Viper in Deadlock requires high mobility, dodging to avoid their slow bullet velocity shots, and utilizing hard crowd control, trying to avoid their bullet as well. So slowing Hex and knockdown, disarming Hex, rusted barrel are all great items against a Viper because you're going to be constantly shooting. So metal skin, bullet armor can negate Viper's burst damage. Movement and positioning, so you want to use extra stamina and sprint boosts to move unpredictably as Viper's can be rather annoying to deal with. So early game aggression, focus on shutting down a Viper during the laning phase. Their squishing and delaying their ability to acquire souls for scaling is super critical. Now, moving on to Warden, the biggest weaknesses of him is that he can get poked down from afar. He lacks a long-range ability. He needs space to get ultimate off since it is a wind-up ability. And Snare isn't the best to engage as it's pretty easy to escape with stamina. So the biggest things to keep in mind is that he excels against opponents that squander their stamina, so you always want to have some escape as best as possible. Then if he misses his alchemic flask during laning phase, you should almost always look to fight while it's down. Then during team fights, Wardens will often duck out of battle to find time to ult with his last stand. If you're healthy and strong enough, you want to stay on top of him to interrupt or kill him before he gets it off. Disarming Hex, Knockdown, Silencing Wave, whatever the case may be, are all great ideas. Using some sort of anti-heal, heal bait, and toxic bullets against him as well is extremely beneficial and good. Now moving on to Wraith. To counter Wraith in Deadlock, you really need to prioritize some armor and spirit resistance, like Ethereal Chef, Unstoppable, or Metal Skin to negate her ultimate and card damage. Defensives are Ethereal Shift, Disarming Hex, Rusted Barrel are all really good. Curse is another great example, and Silencing Wave. For laning and positioning, you want to respect the cards. You want to avoid getting hit by the cards as best as possible, which deal a high amount of spirit damage, especially in the early stages. And you want to keep your distance, so stay near your Guardian and use cover to avoid her line of sight, base the ultimate. And that's really about it. Pretty straightforward encountering Wraith. She's not really in the meta right now. She's not that good right now, but maybe in the coming future, she'll be a lot better. Now last but certainly not least is Yamato. Now countering Yamato requires high mobility, anti-heal items, and respecting her 5-second ultimate invulnerability. Your key strategies include things like Ethereal Shift, silences, curses to stop her abilities, and buying heal blade and toxic bullets to reduce her lifesteal. And you want to avoid fighting her directly during her ultimate, or you want to run away or use cover. So when she triggers her ultimate, she has 5 seconds, and you want to wait it out behind cover, or if she is slow, continue to damage her so she dies immediately upon the shield expiring. Anti-heal, just like a majority of the characters, is a mandatory. Also, silencing and curse are all great ideas. In terms of laning and mobility, during the laning phase, you want to dodge her power slash as best as possible by moving sideways as it's highly telegraphed. And you want to keep your distance to avoid her 3 Crimson Slash. Fighting from high ground makes it harder for her to land her abilities. And that's pretty much how you counter every single character in Deadlock as of now. And if you want to see even more in-depth guides or tutorials, let me know in the comments down below, and make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel if you're new, and share it to your friends so they can always find their counters. But regardless, I hope you have a safe and great day, and I'll catch you in the next one.